Well, I want to begin this morning by asking, first of all, a question to see if anyone's even going to get this. And I'm sure many of you will, even if I didn't ask the question. But any of you out there have been paying attention for the last week to Facebook at all? Even open Facebook at all? Anybody? Okay, a few of you? It's okay, don't be ashamed if you do that. I just want to clarify something right now. This outfit is blue and gray. What has been remarkable to me in watching the last week a huge blow-up over a dress that happens to be black and blue is seeing arguments break out over this thing. They say every so often something comes along that breaks the internet, and this is one of those things. And it was remarkable to me to even have the designer of the blue and black dress say that she was stunned by all of the arguments over this because it is in fact blue and black. The lighting or whatever caused it to look to be gold and white, whatever it was, it's not gold and white. It is black and blue. And it is remarkable to me to see how many people, even after she put out a video explaining this, how many people still insisted it was gold and white. There was an old Star Trek Next Generation episode, I know, John, you're going to appreciate this, where you have Captain Jean-Luc Picard, who's been kidnapped and is in front of these four lights. And his captor keeps insisting, no, there's 5 lights. He's trying to break the man down. And at the end, I'll never forget, he says, no, there are 4 lights, just to throw it in his face as he's walking out the door. He didn't break him. And people resist the truth and resist the truth that's happening in your lives over the silliest things. People insist on seeing what they see and explaining that that is what exactly has to be happening regardless of the obvious. Today, I want to talk to you about a story in the Bible where people resist the obvious. And I'd invite you to turn in your Bibles to John chapter 9 is where we're going to start today. John chapter 9, and I'm going to be skipping around a little bit through the entire chapter because the whole chapter is a great story about senseless resistance and how to deal with it. Starting in verse 1 through 7, it says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Then he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. The story goes on to tell us that neighbors could not figure out what had happened and how. They couldn't trust this man's explanations for why he could see. And so we come to verse 8. It says, yes, I'm the same one. This is after family and friends cannot trust what just had happened. Yes, I am the same one. Verse 11, he responds again to these same resistors. The man they call Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I could see. His own friends and family, the Bible tells us, could not stand the explanation. They couldn't understand it, so they went to the authority that they knew. They went to the Pharisees. And they could not accept what he said either. They tried to get to the bottom of what had happened and who had done it, and they grilled him over and over again, and he kept replying things like this. Verse 15, he put mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. And in verse 17, when he could only draw one conclusion based on his knowledge of anything, he says, I think he must be a prophet. After they kept asking him, who did this to you? Who did this to you? Then they went after the man's parents. It wasn't enough to just go after the man himself. They start going after family now. They go after his parents, who immediately pass the buck back on to the kid because he's old enough to answer for himself. And in verse 25 and 27, after they've been grilling him over and over again, he says, I don't know whether he is a sinner, but I do know this. I was blind, and now I can see. Look, the man exclaimed, I told you once. Didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? I believe this would be what we would call today sarcasm. Finally, they claimed to not know Jesus' origins, to which the man replied way too logically for them. Why, that's strange. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he is ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. Duh. They just could not stand this and threw the man out of the synagogue and out of the temple, saying he was born a sinner, simply for stating the obvious. You know, the one thing I notice about this gentleman, he didn't play small, did he? He didn't minimize what happened to him. He just stated the facts. And the truth is, when Jesus does something in our lives, we do not serve anybody around us or ourselves at all by downplaying what has actually happened, by minimizing the truth. Nelson Mandela was once quoted as saying, "You are a child of God. Your playing small doesn't serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you." The insecure around us, and there's lots of them. They're in your homes, perhaps. They're in your workplace, your school, your neighbors. They could be here in the church. The insecure around us are often those who should actually be the most secure. They're the people with jobs. They're the people with homes. They're the people with families. They are the religious. We've been speaking of messy spirituality in this series called Jesus Gets Messy. And this is part 3, called Resisting the Resistors, or we could say it, resisting those who are too insecure to hear the truth. If you have a spiritual life in which Jesus has entered your life and is doing something in your life, there's going to be people around you who are offended. And a lot of times they are the most religious. The insecure religious resistors were those whom Jesus actually most offended, and he's still offending them today. Understand what I mean when I say the religious resistors. They're the ones around us that see spirituality in a box. They can't see outside of it. It means one thing to follow Jesus and one thing only, and you can only express it one way. You cannot deviate from rules or tradition. The religious resistors do not like to be challenged. They do not like to be surprised. They dislike a spirituality that threatens the status quo. When I was a kid, I used to love a poet by the name of Shel Silverstein. And my kids like him a lot too. But he wrote a wonderful poem about those who have been silenced. It's called The One Who Stayed. And this brilliant twist on the Pied Piper, we're told about a man who piped away the kiddies. All the children of Hamlin Town leave, dancing and spinning and turning. except for one boy. He stayed home, and his father affirmed his son's refusal to follow the Pied Piper. The father said his son was lucky he wasn't found by the piper's music, or he would have been witchcast like all the rest. But the son knew better. He knew that the piper's music had stirred something in him, something life-giving, and that he would regret silencing his longings to follow him. And the poem goes like this: I cannot say I did not hear that sound so haunting hollow. I heard it clear. I was afraid to follow. Those of us who have heard the sound of Jesus' voice and sense life and hope and adventure, those who are willing to speak up and question the deadness around us and express our desire for life, we cannot keep quiet even if everyone around us tells us that we're crazy. And the crowd is going to call you crazy. I don't know about you, but I am one that needs help with this. I need to know what to do when the resistors show up. I need to know what to do when my walk with Jesus, because this is what this ultimately is about, when my walk with Jesus bothers someone else and they tell me to knock it off. The blind man in John 9 tells us the gospel. Jesus' grace and salvation for messy people. The reality of the world's reaction to his grace and salvation of messy people. And how a changed person can live and react to those who don't like it, to the resistors. So let's go back through this story again and look at the themes here that can help us understand what we should do when that happens. And it will happen, guaranteed. Your walk with Christ and what you do to express it, if it looks different than somebody else, it's going to make somebody uncomfortable. So what do we do when that happens? So let's go through this story. I want to start again back in the first 5 verses. Here's a summary of that. We'll just read the first 2 verses to start with. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? Well, the first thing I notice about this text, I don't know about you, but I notice that both Jesus and the disciples actually do notice this man. They notice the blind man. They notice the messy one who has not yet encountered Jesus. It's not unlike what disciples of Jesus would do today. Jesus still sees the blind one, and he still notices, and the disciples also notice. So on a grand scale, a lot of Jesus and most of his true followers are going to see somebody who is in their mess and want to do something about it. The disciples and Jesus do notice the blind man. But here's what happens next. The disciples start looking for the reasons for his blindness. You could maybe put it another way. They are trying to develop a theology of blindness here, to try and explain what is actually happening. It was pretty normal in that time to do something like this because the temptation was always to look for the reasons that somebody was sick or blind, or maybe because someone lost a loved one. In those days, it was easy for them to try and look back in their history of their people and say, there's a cause for this. This person's sin made this happen. They would look back to the text like Exodus 34 where God is appearing before Moses and says, I'm visiting the sins of the parents on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation of those who hate me. They seem to leave that part out. They also seem to leave out the other parts of Scripture where it says every person's responsible for their own sin, not for what their parents did. You've got to balance all of these things out, folks. You can't just look at one thing and not look at the big picture. So the disciples are looking for reasons for this man's blindness, just like many people did in those days. It was a very current idea that all suffering in this life had its origin in sin, which I believe to be true, but furthermore, they'd take another step with this, that every disaster pointed to some particular sin. In other words, you get a skin disease because you swore a few days ago. I mean, that was the kind of thinking that they had in those days. But Jesus takes a very countercultural approach to this. The disciples are looking for reasons. Jesus is looking to do something. It says there in verse 3, it was not because his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. While the disciples look for reasons, Jesus looks to reveal God. To reveal God's power through healing this man. Because that really is the power of God, is making broken people whole. God's mission is about to be made visible. Truly, this is the culmination, the big moment in this man's life. The reason he is there that day is to reveal the power of God. And the reason that any of us are where we are, even in our brokenness, is so that God's power can be revealed. It's easy to assume something in our day and age. Why? We ask questions like, why would God allow somebody to be born blind in the first place? Why would God allow this to happen to my loved one? Or why would he allow it to happen to me? But this is to assume a reaction that this man had. I don't think that his reaction was, God, why'd you make me live this way for so long? All we read about is a man who is healed and celebrating it. All we read about is somehow God's power is revealed in this person. Verse 6 and 7, we move on, and we read here that Jesus really does reveal God's power. He spits in the dirt and he makes clay, and he spreads it over this man's eyes. And in our society today, we read that and kind of gross out a little bit. You just spat in mud and put it on somebody's eyes. That's gross, Jesus. In that day, it probably wasn't that big of a deal because they didn't look at gross the way we look at gross. In fact, something like that might have felt pretty good to a person whose eyes were dry and they'd been in the desert for a long time. And, you get the picture of something that could be relief, actually. But the thing about what Jesus did continues to amaze me. He broke all of the cultural rules and norms to reveal God in this person. The Jews had 39 laws about what you could and could not do on the Sabbath. 39 of them. If you did certain things, you were nailed for it. And one of those things would be to add liquid to mud or to dirt to make any kind of something that you could turn into bricks, basically. They went to that kind of extreme to say, okay, you can't even make mud because you could use that mud and mortar to make bricks. So when he spits on the ground and makes this clay paste, they could say, well, that could be used as mortar for mud, for making bricks or for putting them together. And so Jesus was breaking one of those 39 ritual Sabbath laws that day. The word tells us that he spread this clay. It's the same word actually we use today. We could translate it into the word anoint or to consecrate. So Jesus broke a Sabbath law, put this, and then basically reconsecrated this man's eyes for their original purpose. And that's what Jesus does. He restores what was supposed to be. Jesus heals this man, and he even anoints this man, and anoints his eyes to be used for the purpose they were created. Jesus sends them to, even after that, this is funny, he then sends him to be ritually cleansed. Now, why would he do something like that? Well, before this man could re-enter society as a fully accepted Jew, as part of the people of God, he would have to go through this ritual cleansing, or else they wouldn't take him back. And so on the one hand, Jesus breaks a ritual law to heal and restore the man, but on the other hand, he tells the man, go ahead and go through the ritual law so you can be restored to your place in society. Jesus is all about restoration. He heals the man, he anoints him, he restores him to his place among God's people. When we come to verse 8 through 12, we have what I would like to call the inquiry of the disturbed. Those would be the family and friends. They're the ones that can't understand what happened, and so they start questioning him about what has happened, and they're confused about what's happened. They don't believe this unusual testimony, and they seek the source and authority of this mystery. And this man's response starts this chain of responses he has, which is basically stating the obvious over and over again. He went to the only authority he could trust. He told them that the man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me to go and wash in the pool of Siloam and wash yourselves. So I went and washed, and now I can see. You see, his family and friends go to the authority they trust, but the blind man goes to the authority that actually had done something. He states the obvious. Now, everything's fine now if they just accept his story, even though they couldn't believe it. But then they can't accept that, and so they go to the next authority that they know, looking for an explanation. And they take him to the Pharisees, and now we have this attack of the name callers. The Pharisees attack the source of their discomfort because they hadn't been comfortable with Jesus for quite a while. They trust in their time-honored traditions of their comfort, and they even undercut those closest to the one exposing their discomfort. It's not enough to just try and take this guy out. Now they got to go after his parents. And they cut down others while building themselves up. We could spend a lot of time focusing on the actions of the family and the friends. We could spend a lot of time focusing on the actions of the Pharisees, but that's not what's really important this morning. What is important for us today in our lives as we're walking with Jesus is to focus on how this man responded. Now, I hope that if you find that any of those things that describe friends or family or Pharisees, if it applies to you, take note and stop it. But let's take a look at what this man did. What can we do when the resistors appear? The first thing I would like to suggest that this man did is he trusted his ignorance even. Rather than make up excuses or reasons that he did not know, he just could admit if he didn't know what he didn't know. He didn't know who the man was who healed him when they came to talk to him. He couldn't apparently see very well until he'd even washed himself. And I find it interesting that this man shows up, rubs spit mud in this man's eyes, and tells him to do something, and the man just does it. Maybe it's because Jesus was the first one to actually offer relief as opposed to just a handout. In fairness, they probably didn't think it to be as gross again as we would today, but this man didn't make any definitive statements when family and friends and Pharisees show up. In fact, the most definitive thing he even said, or you could say he assumed, was, I think he might be a prophet. What I admire about this man is not only could he trust that, but he could even admit it and be willing to say, I don't know. Folks, if people come and ask you about what's happening between you and Jesus, and you don't really have a good answer and don't really know, you're better off saying, I don't know, than make up something that makes no sense in the long run. He is willing to say, I don't know. In fact, he does it twice in this passage. And then what I do admire is he at least told the truth that he did know. Yep, I'm the guy that was blind from birth. Yep, I'm the guy that was healed. Yep, I'm the guy rub the spit mud in my eyes. And he told me to go wash, and I did that. Yeah, I'm the same guy. And now I can see. I was blind, now I can see. I told you once and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You want to be his disciples too? He healed my eyes. God doesn't listen to sinners, but he hears those who worship him and do his will. No one can open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done this. Just tell the truth. If people ask you about what's happening between you and Jesus, just tell the truth that you know. You don't have to make up stuff that you don't know. Just tell the truth that you know. And finally, what does he do? He trusts his relationship with Jesus ultimately. In fact, when you get to verse 35 through 38, it says there, when Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the man answered, "Who is he, sir? I want to believe him." "Well, you've seen him," Jesus said, "and he's speaking to you." "Yes, Lord, I believe," the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. Interesting. Apparently, a few minutes with Jesus teaches you more about God than a lifetime of studying about Jesus. Where do you feel broken? Where do you feel blind? Where do we feel messy today? Your health may be in decline. Maybe you feel old and washed up. Maybe you feel forgotten. Maybe you're tired of the daily grind and find no way to fit Jesus into the mess of your schedule and your life. Maybe you feel mistreated by the religious. Maybe you feel crippled by and mourning a loss. Maybe you feel like no one takes you seriously because you're too young and inexperienced, or you feel like no one wants you because of a mistake you've made in your past. Maybe you feel like you're losing control, that your history is weighing you down and you see no way of escape. What I would like to suggest today is that we can learn from this one broken person what we can do. First of all, never forget that Jesus notices you. Never forget that Jesus notices you. Never forget that Jesus wants to display God's power and his mission in you. Never forget that Jesus wants to heal and restore you today. And never forget that he wants you to have your place among his people. He doesn't just heal our wounds, he restores our place. And Jesus also wants to put you back on the path of your purpose. Don't ever forget that. The world's not going to like it. There'll be someone around you that does not appreciate what's happening in your life. They're bothered by something that's happening outside their comfort zone. There may be some poor, confused souls that attack what they don't get. They may take jabs at your family. They may take jabs at your friends. That's okay. When it happens, all we have to do is remember this man's example. Trust your ignorance. Be willing to say, "I don't know." Tell the facts so that you do know, and trust your relationship with Jesus above all things. Because that's what the restored ultimately do. The restored trust the relationship with Jesus no matter what. You'll be closer to God. You'll learn more about him in 1 minute than you will ever learn about him in a lifetime of studying. But study too. Because guess what? Your relationship with Jesus will back up what you study, and what you study will help your relationship with Jesus. What can I offer you today? I invite you to take out your connection card. You know, there's nothing today that I can offer you except Jesus. Let him display God's power in you. Come to him and say, "Lord, heal me of my messiness and my brokenness and my blindness, and do something in me that I can't do for myself. Let Him display God's power in you, because when we do that on a daily basis, He will answer that prayer. Guaranteed. If you say in the morning, God, display your power into me today, at some point you're going to notice that He's actually doing that. Let Him accomplish His mission in you. Let Him restore you and heal you and place you among His people and restore your purpose. God will do all of that. What can I say today except trust your relationship with Jesus? No matter what. Say yes and trust that relationship with Jesus. But I want to just take a look at this here for just a moment. And I hope this is touching your life somewhere today, that you're hearing this and saying, yes, I need to do that today. First of all, under my next step on the back of the connection card there, it could just be a prayer for you today. And I've kind of put two options. Lord, help me to follow you even when it's tough and the resistance comes. Are you willing to pray that prayer today? First, Lord, I would even say, preface this by, Lord, heal me, display your power in me, and help me to stay true to you even when the resistance comes. Or maybe the second thing, Lord Jesus, thank you for noticing me in my distress and blindness and messiness. Please display your power and mission in me this week and restore my purpose that you created me for. Display your power in me. Maybe there's something entirely different that God's teaching you and you need to respond completely differently than anything that's on here, and that's fine. Find a space on there, write it down, that's great. But I'm just wondering, what is the step God is calling you today? Can we trust our relationship with Jesus? Can God display His power in you? I'll give you a prayer and just in a few moments to fill this out, and we'll collect these with our tithes and offerings in just a few moments. Father in heaven, thank you so much for your goodness, for your love, for entering our mess. I pray, Lord, that you would open us up, Lord. I pray that you would come in. I pray that you would display your power in each and every person here. But also help us to know when that happens, we can stick with you. It can continue to make a difference. And we can keep trusting in our relationship with you even when the resistance comes. So we cast ourselves upon Jesus right now. Be with us now as we consider what our next step is. In your name, amen.